Hi everybody, Vanquished Angel here, and today's video is a request. Now, the request was to please make a video explaining the different types of Linux and what is KDE, Debian, etc. Now, this question kind of poses a very valid point in the Linux community, is that we use a lot of acronyms, and for new people, a lot of times they don't really understand what those are for or understand the terms that we use, especially if they're coming over from Windows or even Mac. In Linux, we have lots of choices of lots of different things. In Windows, you don't. You're sort of stuck with what you got, maybe one or two alternatives, but for the most part, people don't really have to understand what those are. So let's break this question down. First off, what is KDE? Well, KDE is a desktop interface, or a graphical user interface for your computer. A desktop kind of is how you interact with your computer. So it's like the menu system and the interface, and can be also a set of programs. So there are several different types of desktop interfaces in Linux that you can choose from and use. Some of the more common ones would be like GNOME, written by the GNU project. Would also be like XFCE, which stands for, the acronym for that is X Forms Common Environment. And then there's KDE, and then there's LXDE, which stands for Lightweight X11 Desktop Environment. And then its successor of LXDE is LXQT, which is written in and Qt is a cross-application framework and widget toolkit for graphical user interfaces. So Qt is basically a program which other graphical user interfaces can be written in. So that kind of basically explains what a desktop interface is. And all of these different desktops have various different reasons or different target audiences. So KDE is written more for those that need a little bit of eye candy. It used to be really heavy on system resources like memory and graphics, and still kind of has that, but not anywhere near as bad as it used to be. And then there's GNOME. GNOME is pretty much the standard desktop usually, and that one's written by the GNU project. Now, the GNU project writes a lot of software for various different distributions of Linuxes. Basically, almost every Linux out there will be approximately hit or miss in there, about 42% actually written by the GNU project. So the term Linux is actually a bit of a misnomer, and I'll cover that in a little bit. And then there is XFCE. Now, XFCE is a desktop environment that is written to be lightweight or easier on system resources, kind of designed for like netbooks and things. And then there is LXDE and its successor LXQT. Those are more lightweight on system resources and designed to still kind of look good and give you a desktop interface, but be extremely light on system resources. I personally use LXDE and LXQT. The LXDE project was sort of dropped, still supported in some distributions, but the developers that wrote LXDE have moved on to LXQT for various reasons. Now, Linux. The term Linux itself. Linus Torvalds authored the first Linux kernel and used a version or an early version of Unix for that. The reason why he did that was because back then you couldn't quite copyright software the same, so it was available to be used. It was sort of open source without open source being quite a thing at that time yet. And so it's a meld of his name, Linus, and Unix, which makes Linux. Now, a lot of Linuxes are kind of inappropriately called Linuxes because Linux actually just refers to that core that Linus wrote. So it actually kind of doesn't really give credit where credit is due, as the vast majority of software on these operating systems is actually written by the GNU project. So So that kind of covers what a desktop user interface is. Now, distros and the different types of distros. Now, there are hundreds upon hundreds of different type of distros out there. Each one has a different focus or different purpose or different reason for being. And then there is what I would call a true Linux as opposed to a not true Linux, which is kind of not a correct term, but some people in history used to use a term like that. So what is a distro? Well, a distro is a Linux operating system that comes with a preset or lack of preset softwares for you to use. So there are, it's kind of complicated to explain, but so basically that's what a distro is. So there are distros like Debian and Knoppix and Gentoo. And these tend to be your more true Linuxes. They're independent projects. They were written kind of their own, and they bring something different to the table. So for instance, Debian is most widely known for its installer. The reason why is because its installer actually surpassed that installer of Windows. Debian relies on the Deb package management systems, so like Synaptic and others. And it was actually easy to install things in Debian because it met the requirements for software. So back in the early days of Linux, you had to install things from a tarball, which is a .tar, BZ, BZ2, or whatever. And then you had to also make sure that you had installed all the required software for that program to run. This is very complicated for new users and kind of deterred a lot of new users. Debian kind of solved that problem with its repositories, and it also made sure that the software, the dependencies for that program were installed to run. So this is kind of what Debian is known for. And then there's Red Hat Enterprises, which initially is sort of the author-ish of Fedora Core. Now, Red Hat Enterprises, has its own operating system that it does for businesses, which is Red Hat. Fedora is the free version, basically, for home users, and it's community maintained. So Fedora is kind of known, Fedora/Red Hat, is kind of known for its multiple contributions to Linuxes and the Linux communities. Initially, Fedora, way back in the days, Linux has had problems because a certain proprietary operating system basically kind of controlled everything, and they had certain copyrights and things that people had to be careful of. And one of those was the little start menu there down in the corner. Nobody else could put the word start down there because that kind of belonged to them and they could get sued. And so a lot of people wouldn't use Linuxes or wouldn't use Linuxes on servers because they really didn't know how to use it. They didn't have a place to start. Fedora got its namesake and Red Hat because, well, Red Hat was around before then, but they put a little red fedora there in the bottom corner. And this was enough so people knew where to start. It sounds so basic, but that actually had a massive impact on the Linux user base that converted to Red Hat. And a lot of these happened to be servers that converted, and so IT people. So that's when Red Hat kind of took over the server market. Another thing that Red Hat is known for is that it used to maintain its a free version out to customers, and it still does. It still oversees it, but actually now the customer version is Fedora, the home user version. And actually, that's the community that oversees that now instead of Red Hat. So it's community-led and community-driven and acts as sort of a testing ground for Red Hat for their operating system for businesses. So basically, it's the community kind of took it over. Red Hat still participates in it, but the community gets to dictate what they want in an operating system, which is kind of ingenious. That's kind of a generalized explanation of that. So we have and then there's, Knoppix and Gentoo and all these other different operating systems, and those two are some of the oldest, and they're still around. Knoppix, generally you'll find Knoppix on rescue CDs for Windows. That's not a joke. Knoppix has been around for a very long time. So has Gentoo. So those are kind of more true Linuxes in the fact that they developed independently, and those distributions they have their own focus, their own target. Then there is the other distributions, which didn't necessarily develop on their own, and they're not necessarily independent. These ones can target other things. So for instance, Debian with its installer made things a lot easier to install software for new Linux users. Then on top of that, Ubuntu came along, and Ubuntu is written or built off of Debian, but Ubuntu's focus was to take care of the little Linux paper cuts that a new user would run into. So these were problems. What was defined as a paper cut was problems that you run into using a Linux that an experienced Linux user deals with just fine, and it's not a problem to them. Because they've used Linux, they have experience, and it really wasn't a focus of their attention for the developers because the problem was so little to them that it really didn't warrant attention. There were other things. But however, a new user wouldn't be able to figure these things out without knowing. And back in the day, there used to be a lot of these paper cuts. And so Ubuntu dealt with the 1,000 paper cut rule, that each of these little tiny paper cuts would deter a new user. So examples of this might be having to script something or go in and edit a file to change it, to adapt it, to make something work. An experienced Linux user is going to know how to go in and edit that file. An inexperienced user is not going to, and it's going to deter them. So that was Ubuntu's focus, but they are still written from Debian. Ubuntu became one of the most popular operating systems, and probably still is today. And then Ubuntu itself spawned a lot of derivatives. So Ubuntu is a derivative of Debian, but Linux Mint is a derivative of Ubuntu. Kali Linux is a derivative of Ubuntu. So Ubuntu, because it became so popular, also spawned other derivatives. So this is kind of cool because each one brings to the table its different take. The only thing that a lot of people would see as a problem with that is that it divides up all these potential developers. So yes, Ubuntu is an excellent operating system. It is one that I personally use, but when it came around, it took a lot of the user base from Debian. So that means it also took a lot of the contributions that would have gone to Debian and moved them over to Ubuntu. And so it kind of took from that project. So arguably, a lot of these people that use all these different variations of Ubuntu or whatever, like in Linux Mint or whatever, could actually all be using Debian, and all that code that makes these different distros so great could have actually been contributed as parts of Debian, I guess. And I kind of do see it that way, and it spreads out the developer force, if you will, among different projects. But it kind of is what it is, and so I might see it that way a little bit, but really Ubuntu brought so much to the table, and not only did it deal with the 1,000 paper cuts rule, it brought a lot of new users to Linux, and they kind of came over in droves compared to before, thanks to Ubuntu. And Ubuntu also happens to be one of the easiest ones for new users to use. That's why a lot of those with that target of being user-friendly is actually written from Ubuntu. So there's that one. And then there's others. There's OpenSUSE, and OpenSUSE has a lot of derivatives as well. So that's kind of what the different distributions are. So hopefully that kind of explains a lot of things. I'm not sure if I answered the question entirely. This could go on and on because there's so many different acronyms, and new users could definitely get confused, and there's so many different options that it can be overwhelming for a lot of users to decide or figure out or target what it is that they want in an operating system slash desktop user interface. You guys have a good day, and thank you very much.